Good afternoon to some and good morning to others. Thank you for joining us today as we kick off The Way Forward, a webcast series on disrupting dehumanization hosted by Forward Promise. Forward Promise is a national program that supports culturally responsive practices that buffer the effects of historical and systemic trauma on boys and young men of color. My name is Keisha Bird. I will be your moderator and host this afternoon. I am the Director of Youth Policy at CLASP, the Center for Law and Social Policy, and I'm also privileged to be a member of the National Advisory Committee for Forward Promise. So for communities of color, we know that we have been suffering through two pandemics, COVID-19 and racism. The successive dehumanizing deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many others spotlight that systemic racism and racial trauma affecting people of color. It spotlights the dehumanization and the persistent invalidation of humanity through both perception, treatment, and it continues to threaten the healthy development of boys and young men of color and their communities, all of us, in fact. So The Way Forward is a 5-part webcast series. It centers 5 dimensions of dehumanization as the foundation for systemic racism and racial trauma. Our panel of experts and leaders today throughout the course of the series will present ways to substantively disrupt dehumanization and affirm the full humanity of boys and young men of color. So we can all agree that that is needed today and that we are in need of this type of conversation today. So today's episode, The Land Isn't Barren, Disrupting Dehumanization of Our Communities, we'll discuss how social dehumanization shows up, including through political gerrymandering, through our education and justice systems, from housing to necessary services. These practices lead to concentrated intergenerational disadvantages. So our panelists will dig into policy decisions. They will talk about narrative change and cultural shifts that illustrate the negative social, economic, health, and political outcomes stemming from these disinvestments and offer recommendations to disrupt this cycle and not just systems reform, but radical systems change. So to get us started, I'm going to have each of our panelists give a 1-minute introduction of themselves. And we have Dr. Howard Stevenson, Leah Austin, Gina Womack, Rashid Shabazz, and Alza Altarafi. Howard?
Thank you, Keisha. I'm happy to be here, and I'm Dr. Howard Stevenson, co-director with Rhonda, Bryant of Forward Promise, and I direct the Racial Empowerment Collaborative at the University of Pennsylvania.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are joining us from. I'm Leah Austin, she, her pronouns, with the Schott Foundation for Public Education. We are a public fund that bridges philanthropic partners and advocacy partners to increase resources in the education justice movement with the goal of providing all children an opportunity to learn and thrive.
Greetings, my name is Gina Womack, and I am a co-founder and executive director of Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children. We're here, our office is located in New Orleans. We're a statewide membership-based organization fighting to disrupt the school to prison pipeline.
And Rashid.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rashid Shabazz. I'm the Chief Marketing and Storytelling Officer with Color Change. We're the largest online racial justice organization, organizing and fighting every day on behalf of Black people through digital campaigns and on the ground organizing in communities to address the issues that impact us and to hold accountable decision makers, corporations, media, and government that have impact on our lives every day. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone.
Hello, my name is Azil Tareifi. I am a disability policy researcher, and I'm also an abolitionist organizer living in Northern Virginia. And I work with my community to advance a transformative vision of liberation and to end carceral ableism.
Thank you. So we can all agree we're in for some real stimulated conversation that we hope will invite you to think, invite you to hopefully do a little healing today and to come away with some actions on how we all can take part of this disrupting cycle. So Howard, we're going to start with you to walk us through some of the cycles of dehumanization.
Thank you, Keisha. I just want to start with a quote by James Baldwin in 1965. He wrote an essay for Ebony called The White Problem in America. And he says, "White man, hear me. History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us." At Forward Promise, we decided early on that if we're going to seriously address the longstanding negative and life-threatening health outcomes of boys and young men of color, we shouldn't focus on the traditional narratives of deficits and pathology. We could not do it without viewing those health outcomes through an historical lens of systemic racism and colonialism. Just recently, the leaders of this country attempted to equate Black and brown enslavement as akin to the recent quarantine from COVID-19 and having to wear a protective mask. This is an example of dehumanization and the diminishment of Black and brown suffering. We feel this disrespect in our hearts, bodies, minds, and souls, and in our very bones. We feel in many respects that we must remember that this is the okey doke of white supremacy. That rage does not have to become our rage. That distortion does not have to become our dehumanization. Now, how do we speak truth to this lie? Well, one, we call it out as a lie. Then we can tell the truth of how this most recent tactic of white supremacy was designed yesterday, today, and tomorrow to diminish our suffering, as well as the resilience of Black and brown communities. It's also important that we remember that this strategy is designed to advocate for the divestment of resources from Black and brown communities and to eventually justify the use of state-sanctioned violence toward those same Black and brown communities. And today we're here to talk about the social dehumanization of those communities. I just want to share a brief summary of the kinds of resources or framework that we use to understand disruption of dehumanization in our communities. And that framework of dehumanization, we start with a definition of dehumanization as a persistent invalidation of humanity through perceptions of actual treatment. It's based on an idea that people of color are unworthy of and do not need basic human dignities. And it threatens the health of boys and men of color and their villages. And we see this dehumanization, as I've just mentioned, manifested in the narratives, policies, and practices that impact them. When we think about the cycle of dehumanization, we're talking about the ways in which these negative narratives about people of color are influencing the dangerous actions towards people of color that lead to harmful outcomes for people of color and eventually are related to the blame and punishment of people of color. In this next slide, the 5 types of dehumanization that we've identified include historical, cultural and spiritual, social, as we'll discuss today, emotional, and physical dehumanization. When we think about historical dehumanization, we're talking about the thoughts, feelings, and actions that lead to policies that also drive mass destruction, punishment, and control of land and people. With respect to cultural and spiritual dehumanization, We're talking about thoughts, feelings, actions that drive policies that demonize, disregard, devalue, and marginalize the cultural and spiritual practices of communities of color. Social dehumanization, as we'll talk about today, are around the thoughts, feelings, or actions that drive policies that divert resources or fail to invest resources in communities of color, as well as restricting the rights of these communities in social, educational, and legal arenas. Emotional dehumanization is about thoughts, feelings, or actions that drive policies that limit the expression of empathy toward communities of color, or again, demonize these communities for having emotions or for their outcry in the face of negative traumatic experiences. And finally, physical dehumanization, which is about the thoughts, feelings, and actions that drive policies that place the physical bodies of members of communities of color at risk of harm. When we think about the ways in which dehumanization affects how young people and people of color and communities think about themselves, is that it's not unlike, or it's not uncommon for folks of color to internalize narratives and think about their own experiences as less than. So thoughts around my history is shameful, or my practices are inferior, or my people are dangerous, or simply a form of socialization that much of what we'll talk about today is meant to disrupt. We're trying to keep young people and communities from swallowing the Kool-Aid of dehumanization that over centuries of socialization have led many of us to think that there's something wrong with us because we are different. And when I think finally, if we look at the larger impact of dehumanization, which is the work that we're most interested in here, is that it not just affects how we think about ourselves, right? But it also affects our hearts, bodies, minds, and souls in many respects, particularly around health, where racialized trauma and colonization have been linked to higher blood pressure rates, higher body mass index, higher stress hormones, poor sleep patterns, and other health and mental health outcomes that we think are preventable if we're able to disrupt how dehumanization plays out in our society. So I'm so happy and excited on behalf of Forward Promise. Today we'll be talking about ways to disrupt social dehumanization. Thank you, Keisha.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. Before we get in with the panelists, I want to just ask you one or two questions. As you all were starting with the work of Forward Promise, you talked about rejecting the deficit narratives.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the Forward Promise journey to get to where you are now in this affirmative and root, seeking and grounding work?
Right. Well, it was essential for us because so much of the understanding and narratives about particularly boys and men of color was around what they did not have and what they were lacking. And in many respects, the notions of starting with therapy and nutrition, for example, as strategies, we're missing the history. We're missing the beginning of how we came to be in neighborhoods that were constructed out of through white supremacist notions, right? Through the ways in which our history of violence and suffering and genocide were not included in the current narratives of how do you help Black and brown boys and their families, however they designate their partners or families. And so some of the work that we understand from looking at our ancestors or spiritual contributions, right, that our humanity is not under question in our own models of culture, right? We don't believe there's something wrong with us simply because we are different in the world. And so we wanted to look at groups, community level groups, grassroots groups who were thinking from a culturally responsive lens to understand that Black and brown humanity is sacred. And there's no reason we ever have to apologize or start from some negative frame before we define how to help them. And so we were committed to say the real problem that we see in this world, as James Baldwin's mentioning in that comment, is the way we have been raged against because we're different. That white rage in particular, based in supremacy, created a lie, a narrative about our diminishment or our suffering not being that much problematic. And we wanted to start there to challenge that narrative first, and to sort of foundationally say our humanity is sacred, our practices are sacred, our belief systems are sacred, and in many respects, our communities are sacred.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. And you started off by talking about the current context we're in now, and how some folks are relegating public health and public safety to the experiences of our ancestors. So, and how are you dealing with the current context? More people are Googling DEI, racial equity, and working on those disparities, but not necessarily getting at the root. How are y'all responding to this current context and, allies or would-be allies wanting to do something?
Sure. Well, I'm so happy that Rhonda, Bryant, and I, when we started, we were very clear that we wanted to hear more narratives and stories from Black and Brown voices, from folks who are working in the front lines, and that we weren't going to follow sort of traditional notions of, again, starting in the middle, right? And so whose stories are we going to center when we sort of support the work of folks in neighborhoods? And so some of the guests that you have today reflect themselves as activists and leaders in communities that are forgotten, right? Instead of going to experts, what due to Flying Earth from the National Academy, Native American Community Academy says that the genius in the community is so forgotten. So we want to embrace that genius in the neighborhoods of communities of color, and say that we're going to center their voices, their stories as the way we develop a program that's culturally responsive, but in many respects doesn't follow the okey doke of traditional service provision in communities of color.
Good, thank you. So I think we'll turn it over and kind of get into this discussion. I think they're ready to get in. So the first part of our discussion is really y'all reacting to the framework of dehumanization and how it, manifests in the work that you represent. And so I guess, Rashid, how about we start with you and then everyone just jump in. We're just going to have a conversation.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Stevenson, for illuminating on both the framework, but also giving us grounding into the conversation today. I'd like to start with acknowledging the fact that these are unprecedented times, that these are times that we are facing that are uncomfortable. We're social distancing. We're not in community in the ways that we're used to, especially as a community of people who are used to community. Being around family, being around friends, being around together and celebrating our humanity. And so I think it's important to start there, that we are also not only facing, as many of us have said, a pandemic of racism and white supremacy, but we're actually facing a real life pandemic that is impacting the lives. And so I think the grounding that Dr. Stevenson gave is really critical. At the work that we do at Color Change every day, I would say it's at the intersection of both policy practice as well as narrative and culture change. And I have the fortune of working every day with a staff of brilliant people working to help address and change both the narrative of Black people as it relates to the world. And we do that through both our campaigns, working on a host of issues from criminal justice reform to education to tech accountability, and also now doing a lot of work over the last 5 years or more in Hollywood to help change the narratives around the Black community, specifically by calling out those practices that have made misperceptions about us and not seen us in the light that we should be seen in. I'm constantly reminded of a quote by Marlon Riggs that we are constantly having to remind ourselves that we are not abomination. And that quote for me is really important. One, because I always reference Marlon Riggs and all the work that I do, because one, he was an amazing documentarian, but two, was through his entry into, and I write about this in some of the work that I've done around young men and boys of color and Black men and boys specifically. But Marlon Riggs has two documentaries that I think are really crucial to this conversation. One is called Ethnic Notions, And the second is called color adjustments. And he obviously has another one, which is profound as it relates to gay Black men, which is Tongues Untied. But specifically, why those two are important for me is that when I think about the work of color change, we don't only just talk about narrative change, we talk about the need for narrative power. And when we talk about narratives, the most important thing to remember, it's really about power exchanges. It's about power. Even right now, when we see the conversation about the Supreme Court, when we see all these things being played out in the media, the real conversation right now that we're seeing is that there's a certain narrative about who's winners and who's losers, what's going to be gained and what's going to be lost. Everything is based inside of a story, a narrative, and that's how we communicate as humans. And for Black people and people of color, we've often been at the whim of other people's gazes. As Toni Morrison says, we've been often within the gaze and under the gaze of whiteness. And our job often at Color Change, and I think for all of us here, is to how to create a gaze from our perspective, how to reposition us within the humanity of ourselves and the work that we do. And so there's a lot of things that we could talk about. There's a lot of things that we could say, but I think it's most important to ground us always in history. I always look at, one, we are people that have come from so much and have endured so much. So this is, when we see the Attorney General, and even since the time we've had our initial conversations, there's been so much. When we have the Attorney General of the country equating restraints to slavery, how do you not get anger? How do you not have rage, as Dr. Stevenson is saying? How do you not think about the ways in which our humanity is constantly being not only marginalized or minimalized, but that the reality is that we have constantly had to face up against these attacks. And what we have to also think about is how do we organize ourselves in these constant moments of attack? Because it's not that we're just vulnerable. We talk about this in the work that we've been doing around COVID-19 and how we message around this. It's not that we're dying, it's actually we're being killed because the policies and practices that are in place are not setting up the systems that will ensure that we can live. It's bad decision-making. It's bad inaction on the part of the government. And so when we move it from behaviors of individuals, which is often the frame in which boys and men of color are kind of rooted in, and we take it to systems and we hold systems accountable, then we have a difficult conversation that people don't want to handle and deal with because it requires real work. Often what ends up happening is that the real work ends up being about let's fix the individuals. And so I'll talk more about that later when we talk about solutions. But I think it's really important to ground that like Black people don't need fixing. Black people are not dying. We are being killed. We are the solutions to our problems, as Dr. Stevenson said, and that the way we respond to these things as both a community and the way that we do the work at Color Change is always grounding about how do we assert our power, how do we move power, how do we build power through the narratives that we tell and the stories that we share. And that means centering our humanity and our reality from our perspective, our gaze, and the way we do our work. And so that's what I would just share as an opening into the conversation is that we're going to remain hopeful in the midst of despair, and we are going to continue to fight because that's what our ancestors did, and we respond out of that call from both our ancestors and those who have transitioned even during this year. And so I'll stop there since I probably have other thoughts later.
Yeah, thank you. I have a lot of follow-up questions for you just about how do we get to narrative power and what are the steps, what does that look like? But we're going to get to that in a little bit later. I'm reminded is that one of our very first National Advisory Committee meetings for Forward Promise, we were on Haley Farm, and we were talking with our Native and Indigenous brothers and sisters about stolen people on stolen land. So we got to start at the historical roots of all of this in order to eradicate, in order to kind of get to that narrative power. So I really like the framing you gave us. So Leah, do you want to jump in and go next about your reactions to dehumanization and social dehumanization, how it's showing up in your work?
Sure, I definitely can. And just sitting here just in awe of the brilliance and passion that's already being displayed by my colleagues. I mean, I represent education, have been in education as teacher, advocate, philanthropist, the whole gamut for a very long time. And so thinking about dehumanization in the educational system is one, a very sobering exercise, because while education should be the place that you are not only affirmed, but you are encouraged to imagine the greatest version of yourself and the greatest version of your place, whether that's community, whether that's country, whether that's your world, it actually ends up in many instances not being that at all. It ends up being a place where you are at the door when children were actually physically going to school. It's where you're told that the language you speak, the accent you have, the way you speak is wrong, right? And so what does that immediately do to, and we're saying like a young person, kindergarten, a 5-year-old, if you think about early childhood, way before you're thinking about 3 and 4-year-olds. I mean, what kinds of messaging does that already send a young human being about who they are? The message it sends is that you were born wrong. You're not quite right. And so now you've come to our system. You've never met us before, but here we are. We're going to fix you. Just memorize this information, right? And you'll be fixed. And so what we see in the school system is kind of two roads, right? There's either you're criminalized or you assimilate. And if you assimilate, then you graduate. You might graduate with some honors and you go on forward. Or the opposite happens. You don't engage in the correct behaviors, and then you're criminalized, and there's a whole different path that has been designed for you to take. And so that's, kind of one way we see dehumanization unfolds in education and in school systems. I think there are kind of 3 other ways that I would just bring up, and we'll obviously have further conversation. But what we know about the relationship between property tax and funding formulas, right? So essentially what we tell human beings is, if you have the resources, if you have enough money to buy, and I'll do air quotes, if you have enough money to buy a good home in a good neighborhood, you deserve a good school. And if you don't, if you're poor, if you come from a family that has low to no income, and you live in a community with other folks like that, then you don't deserve, you're not as good as a human being, so you don't deserve a good school, you deserve a different kind of school. And you can almost draw a line right down the center of the resources or lack of resources that you will see in those different environments. And all of that is drawn from this, I think, this real belief that you are less than, that you're not a human being, so you do not deserve the basic rights, the basic necessities that a human being deserves. So we see it in that way. Another way I'd say we see it in education is in the practices, right? So there's this attitude that if you are from a low income, if you are poor, anybody can teach you, right? So anybody that raises their hand and says, I'm willing to go into that terrible school and teach those terrible people, I'll do it. So you get anybody, right? And think about the other people who are in those buildings, right? So we've seen, and we'll definitely talk about this more in the conversation, but the movement for police-free schools, right? And so there's this attitude, there's this belief that, well, you are inherently such a bad behaving individual. Worse than that, it's animalistic. You're more animal than human. So we need to have police in schools. We need people in schools who actually their jobs are designed to manage your behavior. Because if they're not there, we're actually not sure what you horrible folks will do to each other, right? Like you're just so bad that's what you need. So we see that. And then pedagogy. What are our students taught in schools? Well, the first thing they're taught, as I mentioned earlier, is that everything you bring to the table inherently that you were born with is wrong. And so we have to fix that. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, we're not even going to bother to teach you about yourself. I mean, look at, I think Rashid said it, like so much has happened, like every single day, so many things are happening. But what was it last week or within the last 2 weeks? This real fear of actually teaching not just Black history, but teaching history accurately just all of this dirt has been thrown up, and all of a sudden it makes you anti-American to even have any sort of interest in understanding the full story of America. Is just another way that unfortunately this plays out in the education system. So I'll stop there because I know there's further conversation and definitely want to hear from our other colleagues.
Yeah. Oh, I have a lot of follow-ups for you too. But let's just let Gina and Aza respond to how social dehumanization and the importance of historical context is showing up in their work.
Yeah, I'll just say real quickly, because my colleagues have already said so many of the things that we would talk about, but definitely we see it around narrative, right? Like, so what is the narrative that is constantly put out for the families that we come in contact with? So one thing, in one way, it's definitely constantly saying that the parents or the caregivers of our young people are unloving, or they don't really care for their kids, right? So they develop, there's a system that is put in place that we're functioning or working or trying to function under. And then we are seen as less than because, we generally can't access what it is that we need for our young people. And so basically then the children are given this narrative that they are labeled as throwaway kids, right? Like no one cares about you, your families don't care about you, look where you live, look what you're doing. So then again, you're less than and you don't deserve anything but a prison system, right? And so then we see it again in action, because now that we've situated that narrative for you, we're going to show you, right? And so imagine, if you will, if you're a parent, a mother, caregiver for a child that you love, and you're looking for help, for services, like you're really looking for what you need to be able to support your young person, many of whom have, have mental health needs, right? And so you are in your community where you pay taxes and you're trying to find what you need and it's not there. And you go for help and you're seeking help wherever you can find it. And you're told that in order to access what you need, you can get that, but it's inside the penal system, right? So many of our families, unfortunately, have to turn to the system. It's already created. They say it's voluntary, some parts, or involuntary. Like even before you have a charge, they, the system is already set up to say that you're going to be who they say that you are. You're going to be a criminal. Therefore, we're going to give you what you need here inside of this system. Because our families have continued to say that they called and they were looking for help, and and they were referred. So you're in the schools, like Leah just spoke about, you're in the schools and you may have police and whatever. And then if they refer you before maybe you come in contact with the law, you're still, you are referred to here in we call families in needs of services. And it sounds like it's going to really be helpful, but it's part of the Supreme Court. So you're, it's there, and they're definitely working to track you through that system. So even though you're working, you're trying to do everything that you need to be able to do to care for your young person, this, the system is right there, and it is set up to send you through not just the school to prison pipeline, but birth prison pipeline, because these situations have been created for you. And when you're looking to do what you're supposed to do as a loving, caring parent, you are tracked into that system.
Wow. Aza, what do you have to add to this? And then we're going to dig into some more of what folks were just saying.
So there's already been so much wisdom shared. So I'll keep my comments brief, but I want to uplift that I work at the intersection of racial and disability justice, and there is no movement for collective liberation, nor is there any movement towards racial justice that will be successful if it does not center disabled people of color. we really kind of fall at this intersection where the entire weight of the criminal legal system and the entire weight of these structures of oppression are used to exert control over people. So we've heard a lot about the school to prison pipeline, but in reality, it's a school to confinement pipeline, because carcerality is not limited to the walls of a jail or a prison. Carcerality exists within our school system because of the ways that we have criminalized and pathologized, because of the ways that we have an entire system, an entire medical industrial complex that simultaneously produces disparities in terms of overdiagnosis within particular communities, right? So we see students of color being overrepresented within certain diagnostic criteria and simultaneously underrepresented within other diagnostic criteria. So they face this duality of both being pushed into a system where they can be forced into some form of psychiatric control or confinement, and having needed resources withheld from them because they don't meet certain diagnostic criteria that were really designed with white people at the center of it, right? And so when I talk about disability justice, and when I apply that praxis, and when I do this work in community with my comrades, what we are talking about is not simply that ableism is a system of oppression that intersects with racism. We're saying that these are systems that depend upon one another, that one cannot exist without the other, that ableism operates fundamentally by ranking and ordering bodies and minds as either valuable or deviant or normative or disposable. And that is a fundamentally racist, fundamentally anti-Black project. And the other thing that I want to really emphasize in this moment of COVID-19 in particular is the politics of disposability are showing up in a very explicitly eugenicist way. And disabled people of color have borne the brunt of that. Over 40% of COVID deaths in this country occurred in nursing facilities and other kinds of carceral facilities where overwhelmingly Black and brown disabled people have been disappeared and rendered disposable. Even our use of war metaphor to describe those on the quote unquote front lines is basically suggesting that death is a foregone conclusion, and it shouldn't be. It was a policy choice. And so in that respect, any analysis that does not center disability justice and does not recognize that our disabilities are political and that our liberation is therefore bound up in affirming the humanity of those of us who are disabled and Black or disabled and people of color, that is necessary for liberation to be possible.
Woo-wee, we're ready for this conversation. You gave us a word, and you just said, we all talk a lot about intersectionality, right? And that's something we've been talking about when we talk about systems of power and racism, patriarchy, and xenophobia and so forth. But a lot of times in our work, we do not center ableism and disability justice. We know that it is a part of it, and it shows up and manifests in our criminal legal system and our education system. But how are we really centering that in terms of our narrative and getting to our shifting power? So Rashid, I'm coming back to you first, because my question, you started talking about narrative power, and a lot of the work that you've been doing throughout your career and with Color of Change is about reclaiming that narrative, reclaiming that power, building that power. So talk to us a little bit more about what it actually looks like. We want to get a little bit beyond some of the words so that we can get to the disrupting pieces of the work that we need to do.
No, thank you. I want to again just acknowledge, just everyone has said so many profound things already, and I'm just following up on a lot of the comments that have been made, and I think Aza, has pulled us back to just remind us that everything is intersectional, and that we have to remember that the issues and that the challenges we face are complex, and that there are no simple solutions. There are no easy answers to something that has been centuries, if not longer, in the making of the dehumanization of Black people in the face of white supremacy and patriarchy. And so when we think about these things and we hold them, the most important thing for me, as someone who works in narrative and has been in communications for a long time. It's just that one fact initially is that oftentimes people confuse communications and narrative. They think that a good PR plan is simply the way you shift narratives and shift culture. But culture is everything that everyone has spoken to. It's the school books, as Leah said, that you teach in the classroom or you choose not to teach in the classroom. It's the humanizing efforts or the dehumanizing efforts that are instituted, as they did with indigenous people when they took them away to boarding schools and they took them away from their families, the same way that we send our children away to schools and we know that they're going to be ill treated each day. You know, at the center of I know everyone who's been a parent and is a parent, the biggest thing that they want is to know their child will be cared for and loved in the same way that they would if it were their own when they go into that schoolhouse. And we know that 99% of the time, that is not the reality, as Gina said, as it maps out for us as Black people and people of color. And so narrative, when we talk about narrative power, it's the effort and the tools that are needed to actually build the infrastructure of resources to change the actual power dynamic as it relates to the way that stories are told about us and how we center ourselves. And that looks like multiple things. Oftentimes, it does include the funding and support of narrative networks that will tell and shift stories through communications and through media. It's the research that needs to be done that needs to kind of complement the work that Forward Promise has been doing, for example, and others. It's the way in which we also look at the industry as a whole that's putting out images every single day, telling us who we are and what we are and how do we disrupt that. And so I'll share some things in the chat later, but some of the things that we've noticed and just the things that we've been working around, it's just the obvious. We know, for example, to Oz's point again, like racial bias is everywhere, racial injustice is everywhere, and they create false perceptions. And so when we think about the healthcare system, we know that the rootedness of that goes back to slavery. We know that the practices of gynecology on Black women's bodies, the ways in which we were experimented on, and the ways that we have an ill relationship to the system is a story that has not been fully told. And we see that in stories when we do have those opportunities, like Henrietta Lacks or someone that is able to tell how the way in which the medical practice creates this, or the Tuskegee experiment. These are things that kind of reinforce certain narratives about us. But I think the one thing that's really important is that in order for us to reshape perceptions, and this is the part of narrative power, we have to start thinking and asking the difficult questions about how those narratives are created. So thinking about how do Black people, oftentimes when we look at the media, and especially right now when we think about protests, and I want to use the protests as a moment because in the beginning, it was like a lot of groundswell. You mentioned allies when we were talking about to Dr. Stevenson. In this moment, we're seeing kind of like a backlash now around protests. People are having like a fatigue around it. And now it's about even the media is misrepresenting the protests as mobs, BLM, Antifa, and you're seeing it being reversed now. And so instead of being about how we're trying to fight for equity, it's now become a disruption to capitalism, a disruption to our day-to-day lives, rather than it being about the injustices and unjust. So we have to first make sure that we're holding accountable media and making sure we're telling the right stories. The second is around accountability. So when we say racism will not end until our stories and until our stories change, we cannot have different ways of approaching these things and we continue to use the same thing. So we talk about balancing stories. Black people are always the problem in stories. So we talk about the need for Black people to create the solutions so we can live in a different way. And so that's why I early talked about the systemic approaches to how we do the work and how we move the work forward. And the last thing I was saying, I mentioned this before, is we have to be careful about languaging we're using. We keep saying that we're dying, but we're in the practice of healing and living. And if we keep saying we're dying, and that's even if it's a reality that there is dying happening around us, is actually because of the systems in place, we're actually being killed. And so we have to use that language to hold the systems accountable. We're not just vulnerable, we're being attacked. And so we say a few things that are really important when we think about narrative change to narrative power. One, Black people are not the problem, we're the solution. We're the solution to this. And there is no progressive change that's happened in this country without Black people. And that's kind of like a starting point at Color Change. The other is that injustice is manufactured. It's not an unfortunate condition. Oftentimes when we think about like a circumstance, like someone getting arrested, as Gina said, we'll say, damn, that's unfortunate. No, that's unjust. And we have to frame it within that because the systems are unjust. Oh, my son's failing school. And then we individualize it. No, the school is failing your son. And so when we start reframing it and we start thinking about it in that ways, then we start seeing a different thing. And then the last thing, which is really crucial in terms of humanization, is that Black people are human. We're not superhuman. We're not exceptional, though we are exceptional in the face of white supremacy and oppression. And we're not less than human, we're human. And I think that's an important part of humanizing the process. Oftentimes we have to be that superhero, or we're the deviant. And we have to move beyond that. And again, we'll talk more about this when I highlight the work we're doing in solutions in Hollywood. But that's like a big key part of it, is that I need to see myself as a human, and we practice ourselves too often times in suffering because we assume we have to suffer as a people. And that's not the way we should pretend to be if we're changing narratives and building power.
Yes. So we'll talk more about some of the specifics, but Gina and then Leah, before we get to our next segment, can y'all pick up about some of the things that Rashid said? Gina, you talked about families and the narrative as if Black families don't care about their children, about their young people. Black communities don't care. How are you seeing that in the work, and how has COVID exacerbated the work that you're doing with the criminal legal system? And the same kind of question for you, Leah, in terms of education.
Yeah, so I definitely won't have to restate a lot of the things that Rashid said. And so again, like you said, COVID only exacerbated the narrative, and what's really happening. But we didn't necessarily have to change a lot about what we're doing, because we've just gotten an opportunity to talk about it a lot more. And I think what's a lot of things that Rashid said and stated made a lot of sense. And so just building on that and thinking about, for us, we really like to start at building tables and building trust within our own communities, so that, we can undo a lot of the narratives that have been thrust upon us, and sometimes that we, take into our own self, and then that comes out in the way that we're acting in community. So it's just really important to have that opportunity to really spend a lot of time together and shred get rid of all of those narratives and create our own and build our trust at the tables. Because tables are really important, because like Rashid said, it's about accountability. And so what does that look like for us? And so we spend a lot of times talking about systemic accountability, because everything that I stated before, we want to build on our strengths, but we also know we're functioning inside of this system that really wants to tear us down. So how can we, what can we do about that? And so we know, because we spend time educating lawmakers, trying to shift and change the laws that are, and make them work in our favor, which I think we definitely need to do. However, we need to really spend a lot of time talking about what that looks like and delving into it. And the system has really created an integral dynamic that makes it really complicated. So we build our trust, and we build our leaders, and we have a saying at Flick that when we're going to the table, it's we're not just at the table, we are the table. And that is helping get rid of the fact that we're not powerful, because we know we are. But a lot of times we're outnumbered when we're sitting in spaces where people are making decisions about our lives and discussing things that they really have no knowledge of. And they create many, many tables, right, that are barriers for us to really get to the spaces that are not only making the decisions, but calling things into action for our community. So we try to, we make sure we spend a lot of times to get to those tables. We educate and we pull apart the laws and how they're impacting our lives. And we're able to, hold the system accountable by, as we say, speaking truth to power. Really hard when you have parents and young people in a room where folks are making the decision and you disrupt that, not only the narrative, but redirect the work that's happening because it's not what we need, right? So it's about like for us, by us, but we have to get in those spaces and be able to make sure those things are happening for us and by us. And it's not something that happens today and goes away. It's as we're coming up on our we just started into our 20th year. And we do know and see how the system corrects itself. Like we feel like we take 2 steps forward and 20 steps backwards. And if we're not consistent and persistent with our historical knowledge, as well as bringing in what we need in this moment, then the system will correct itself and we'll find ourselves back where we were, right? And so we have to keep changing and keep shifting the narrative and continually making sure that our families know that they have the solutions, right? And so it's a lot of work. It's not something that can happen just really quickly and overnight, because it's a continual drumbeat. It's continually being at the table, because if you turn and look at something different, they've created another table and another table, and they've created laws on top of laws. So we've learned over the years that we have to do a lot of dissecting and being around. We can't go to the next thing because there is no next thing, right? It's always keeping and saying that, we're not to, our bodies are not to be incarcerated. We are to, bring our history and know our own strength and our own beauties, and then build our own systems. But up until we are able to do those things, we definitely have to make this system work for us.
Yes. So Leah, we're going to actually get ready to have a poll and a stretch break. Then we'll come back to talk a little bit more, just continue the conversation on solutions. And so everyone, I know we have people joining us from Boston, from Philly. We have people from Washington State. It's just been inspiring and powerful. Just loving what everyone is saying, and it's giving me energy. The ups and downs every day. We don't know, we have to protect our own mental health, and having this space, we are socially distant, but physically distant, but spiritually connected right now. So I really appreciate that. So let me get to this poll, and then we have a special guest, Dr. Phil, who will just be walking us through a stretch break and helping us to recenter ourselves. So the poll, and I think they're putting it up here. So we learned about the 5 dimensions of dehumanization, and we dug a little bit deeper into social dehumanization at the start of the conversation with Dr. Stevenson. So the question for you is, did you learn things about your community or other communities, both yours and others, that you haven't known before? So how have you learned things with your community, other communities, or both your and other communities? It's a mouthful for that question. And then you see the survey link, and we'll be giving answers or responses to the survey at the end of discussion. All right, so now we're going to introduce Dr. Phyllis Hubbard. She is a part of our Forward Promise Boys and Men of Color and social justice family. You changed my life so much, I think last year in California, and helped me to refocus energy on myself and healing. And I so appreciate you and taking the time, even virtually, to offer this space for us. So I'll just turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Really intense, heavy conversation, but what sticks out to me is our ability to speak our truth to power. And in order to do that, we need to be grounded and centered. And so sitting is the new smoking. So I invite you all to stand up, and we'll do a quick stretch to open up the space between the vertebrae and the spine, and end with just a way of centering ourselves in, just being able to speak our truth to power. And so if you choose to stand, I invite you to make sure that your feet are shoulder width apart. You pull the shoulders up, back, and down. And then take a breath in and lift the arms up overhead very slowly. And as we exhale, ease our way to the left. Good. Take a breath in, reach up. And as we exhale, ease our way to the right. Breathing in, reach up. And as we exhale, slowly bring our arms down into a prayer position between the eyebrows. And from here, we take a breath in. And we remind ourselves as we exhale to allow our eyes to be windows and not projectors, so that we will always see what's there. Taking a breath in, lowering the palms down in front of the mouth. And as we exhale, reminding ourselves to speak our truth, even if we believe it will cause discomfort to others. Taking that breath in, lowering the palms down in front of the heart, and reminding ourselves as we exhale that when we speak our truth and we speak from the heart, we will always speak our truth with love. Thank you so much, everyone. Be well and be radiant.
Thank you for that centering and the stretching. Hopefully the Forward Promise team will drop some links in for you so you can get in touch with Dr. Phil. Her work is truly amazing. And we started off the conversation with Dr. Stevenson talking about how this dehumanization is killing us. And Rashid helped us to reclaim that language. It's not that we're dying. It's not that we're sick. It is literally killing us and has killed us in so many different ways. So it's important to get grounded back into our physical and spiritual selves. So we did the stretch break. And so we're ready to jump back in. We already started on solutions. It's kind of hard to just stay on historical in the kind of dehumanization part without shifting to how do we disrupt? I mean, we're evidence of that disruption, just our existence. I like to say, my existence is resistance. And so we're evidence, but then this is about social dehumanization. So this is about how do we disrupt those policies, those investments. I was really struck by Gina and Leah talking about, the absence of investments, the absence of funding. And a lot of the work that I've been doing throughout my whole career, working with young people, trying to change systems on their behalf or with them, is really about putting in what it needs to be in place to help them and their families thrive, and especially in our Black and Brown communities. And too often we focus on individual restoration. I always say, what good is it if you have a whole person in the midst of toxic water? You think about fish or something. I've killed dozens of fish when I was growing up because the water was not clean, or it was too hot, or it was too cold. And so it doesn't matter if you have a healthy fish, if you're putting it, if the existence in this toxic environment. So we're talking about creating and disrupting that toxic environment, or not even disrupting, actually getting rid of it, right? And so I'm gonna start with you, Leah, and then we'll go to you, Aza, just to talk a little bit more about, you gave us a pedagogy. You talked about, criminalization or assimilation for students. You talked about funding, and we know that's a fundamental piece of education policy that we have to change to disrupt some of the dehumanization. But talk to us about some of the solutions that you're working on with your work, or that you think this needs to happen.
Definitely. So one, I needed like 10 more minutes of Dr. Phil. That stretch break was everything that I think we all needed. So I really appreciate just how you all are thinking about this time together and making sure that something like a stretch break is provided. So a couple of things. One, I will say this is kind of somewhat of a reflection of what Rashid shared, but also connects to your question, Keisha. And in education, I think one of our, I put it like on the small scale solution, but it has a real like ripple effect. And it's like the sheer sentiment around the language that we use to describe children and families. And so as Rashid was talking, I just started to sort of list the words that we use when we talk about children and their families, but in particular children. So we describe Black and brown children in school environments as at risk, as vulnerable, as disadvantaged, as unteachable. Same language as applies to their families, but then we would add language like uncaring. And so you hear a lot of, folks will talk about these families, parents who just don't care about their kids. And so, there's like this, and I say small in the sense that there's this language shift that just has to happen in terms of how we talk about children and their families. But it's not just about the words, it's all what those words mean, and right, what the power that those words actually pack. And so what does it mean to be an educator in a school system? What does it mean to be a student in a school system? And that's the frame that you're either using to teach, which means your frame is then that you need to fix. It's from a deficit based. And if you are the child or you're the family, and this is the language that's being used to describe you, you then believe you are less than, and again, you're put in the system to be fixed. I think that's one solution, is really pushing on our educational system and our educational experts to use different language and to use accurate and real language to describe us. The second part that's probably a little larger, and it may be a little bit of a Debbie Downer, but hopefully, hopefully we can pick up from this, is I just would say that we can't fix the public education system as we know it with the tinkering around the edges that we have been accustomed and used to, right? And so that is very much about education policy, and even in practice, like what we talk about is how do we fix things that were designed to do exactly what they are doing? So we're actually very successful in the public education system. And so there's no fixing that we can do right now. What we believe we have to do is we have to reconstruct, that this is a time to seriously reimagine the kind of education, the kind of teaching and learning that we want not just children of color to have, but all children to have an experience. And that is very much about the reconstruction of education, of where education happens. And I will say this, I'll just pause and say that I kind of fear saying that, because I think what happens a lot in the education conversation, at least, is when you start to talk about reimagining or reconstructing, people automatically hear dismantle public education and build more charter schools or for-profit schools. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. What I'm saying is to really think very differently and create a brand new vision of what we actually want our children to learn and to know, and really to go back to what are the purposes of education? What's the purpose of education? I think we need to do some real serious work there. This is a moment, I believe, that elements of Afrofuturism are not just shiny, pretty, attractive objects, right? That's a real like philosophical moment that we're in. We know that this country will continue to be more Black and more brown, which is why, you know, with all of the reactions we're seeing are to those data points. And so there is no vision of the future if it is not both informed by and based on the experiences of people of color. And so in our work, as we're thinking specifically about the education system, we can't continue with the current system that we have. We have to reimagine and reimagining can sound very like, you know, fluffy unicorns and lollipops, right? But it's serious work. We have to invest time and space to really say, what is the vision that we have? And then as Gina mentioned with the tables, and what's then the power that we build so that we can both demand and obtain that vision. And as you see, I have a 6-year-old. This is just what we do.
Yes.
All part of the work. This is real life. So yes, I also have a 6-year-old that has decided to join the conversation. But
Yes.
that would be my reaction, Keisha.
Yes, and that's what we're here for, right? Like we're here so that our future generations don't have to be having this same conversation, or at least it's a little bit different. But as we want to bring you back into this conversation, you opened us up by not talking about just intersectionality, but interdependence. So just kind of riff off of your reactions and getting to the disruption part of the dehumanization that you were talking about.
Absolutely. So interdependence is actually one of the core tenets of the disability justice framework. And I think never more than in this current moment of physical distancing has this really, really crystallized. And I think one of the things that is often used to describe this moment is unprecedented. I think if there was a word cloud of 2020, 80% of it would be the word unprecedented. And one of the things that I want to emphasize, though, is for disabled people, a lot of this actually wasn't all that different from what we were experiencing before. It was just magnifying it. So for many disabled people, we have had to be used to not having physical access to spaces, not having language access to certain spaces. And many of us have long lived, myself included, with immunocompromising conditions. So we often were distancing ourselves because the world was not designed or built with us in mind. And so I think in that respect, disabled people are really some of the folks that are best equipped to really guide us through this moment, and yet are the people who are being so systematically erased and marginalized, and whose deaths, whose murders, right, whose killings are being justified and normalized. And so one of the reasons, one of the ways that we kind of see that eugenicist discourse and those politics of disposability showing up, it is a kind of just the intense dehumanization that continues to be compounded as we face more and more kinds of precarity, right? So we're facing economic precarity. We're facing displacement because of the climate emergency. We're becoming disenfranchised in much broader and systematic ways. All of these crises are creating all these forms of precarity. And through that process, certain categories of people are being purposefully left out, are having life-sustaining resources deliberately withheld from them. So one of the things that I want to uplift in terms of our solutions and what this looks like, just 3 things. 1, if you are not in community and if you are not building with disabled people, just know there are disabled people in your lives. And the fact that they are not sharing or disclosing that might mean that there needs to be a serious reckoning around whether or not the spaces that you've been building and the spaces that you've been part of were accessible, and figure out how to make them accessible. There is no reason that people should be left out when they are the ones who are most severely harmed by these systems. Those of us closest to the pain are closest to the solutions. And we can't be implementing those solutions if we're not even hearing them and getting them through the door. The second thing that I want people to think about is, in a time of ascendant fascism, the normalization of 200,000 plus deaths is unacceptable. It is violent. 1 in 3 Black people in this country personally know someone who has died to COVID-19. I am one of them. One of the closest people to my life, my cousin, died because of this virus, but specifically because of manufactured scarcity and deliberate policy failures that designated her as disposable, an acceptable loss. So one of the ways that we disrupt that form of dehumanization is by grieving, by creating intentional spaces of communal grieving and an opportunity for us to collectively affirm and uplift those we have lost, to name them and to honor their full humanity, and to push back and to uplift their names as a form of resistance against this normalization of a mass death event, of mass violence being enacted by the state. And then the final thing that I want to say is I am an abolitionist, and I approach this from an abolitionist disability justice praxis. And I invite people to check out the abolition and disability justice.com website, which contains a platform that really articulates in more detail than I can get into now what our vision is, what this looks like. But we want to abolish carcerality. We want to abolish it in every space that it's in. All forms of confinement need to be abolished. And I want to uplift the wisdom of abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Abolition is not absence, it is presence. It is about building life-affirming institutions that make things like prisons and jails and psychiatric facilities and nursing facilities and every single detention center that has disappeared people and rendered them disposable. We build life-affirming institutions that make those spaces and make that criminalization and carcerality entirely obsolete, and something that will not ever be turned to, and that future generations will read about but never have to experience.
Wow. As of last week, I cried. We had a session with Kara Page talking about healing justice. And with my colleague at class, we've been embarking on what we're calling healing-centered liberation policy. And it's a difficult process to be introspective of your own work and your own complicity with reforms and tinkerings that you mentioned, Leah. But we have to do it and sit in it, but we've been placed in these positions and forced to do that. But we have an opportunity to break out of that. And a part of that process, you know, as I'm doing myself and in community with folks like yourself, is we have to grieve in order to heal and to have the voice that we need to have, that we are called to have in order to disrupt and build that power. So Rashid, I'm coming back to you because you said a few things earlier and you want to give us some examples because, you know, we've all been riding with Color Change for years, right? And have just been amazed at the power and the visibility that the organization and the movement and the people have given to all of us. So you want to give us some of those specific examples, but also build on what you heard from Aza. Like, what does that look like for your work?
Well, I want to first start with holding space for Aza and the collective grief that we all have probably are experiencing. I think that I pointed to it earlier, but obviously her words, not only poignant and on point, but really clear about one, the personal toll that this pandemic is having, but also going back to the point that this is not just solely about the pandemic, as she framed it, as I've been framing it, this is manufactured in the sense of how systems are at play in terms of ignoring our rights, ignoring our needs, and marginalizing particular communities, disabled, Black people, other individuals in our networks and our communities as either disposable, as she mentioned, and in many ways, when you look at the numbers now at 200,000, the majority of those being Black and brown people, there's no other word but genocide in some ways. And when we think about the numbers of people, and so when a government is being so abject in its responsibility and its accountability, which is our job as advocates, our job as individuals committed to change, I want to first acknowledge Aza's words and just hold space there for her loss and her cousin. I think the other thing is, Color Change just marks our 15th anniversary. Shout out to Gina down in NOLA and the work that New Orleans as a cultural haven, right, for Black people in this country, from jazz to hip hop and to a host of other ways in which we manifest our presence as Black people, culturally speaking. But Color Change emerged out of the travesty of Hurricane Katrina, which was marked the 15th anniversary a month ago, almost a month ago. And it was out of that emerged our proposition that no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. No one's ever nervous about disappointing us. No one's ever fearful about what our decisions and what our concerns are. No matter how we vote, no matter how we organize, no matter what we do, until we stand up and we fight for our power and our rights. And so Color Change is bred within that kind of ethos of accountability, holding accountable government, policymakers, corporations, who are the enablers of the things that Ozzy spoke to and the injustice that we face every day. We know that there's billions of dollars that were made throughout the pandemic, trillions of dollars. People are making money. The stock market, surprisingly, is continually to go up while people are losing jobs, while Black people are continuing to work as essential workers on the front lines to make sure we are fed, as people of color are doing that as well. So when I think about solutions, I think there's a few things I just want to say in this frame of, and I'm not sure how much time we have, but just a couple of things I just want to note that has emerged out of the pandemic. The first is I want to acknowledge, again, what Ozzy was saying, but a piece that I had written early on was like the merger between the pandemic and the protests. And you said, Keisha, the idea about holding space to breathe. I mean, this pandemic has not allowed us to breathe. As we saw with George Floyd, I made the connection back in recognizing that we saw this with Eric Garner and nothing had really changed since then. He said the same words, and yet here we are in a pandemic where we're literally dying because we can't breathe. The correlation between those two things are salient for me because it reveals both the health crisis that we're facing, the infrastructure crisis we're facing, but the crisis in the criminal justice system, to Oz's point. So not only is it that, and even what Leah's saying, education system, every system is failing Black people and people of color. And there has to be a point where we offer the solutions and that we become the solution, because obviously this system has continually just to fail us. And so one of the things that we noticed when we put out a report in the beginning of the year is that the way that media and stories often reinforce stereotypes. So we put out a report called Normalizing Injustice. Those who are watching could go to normalizinginjustice.org. It was looking at the crime TV genre. And it was looking at shows like Law and Order and everything that we have come to watch. And those shows, what we know is we're reinforcing certain stereotypes around the community, things that we already know. But then more importantly, not only are they reinforcing, but they were creating a sense of how the criminal justice system works and functions. And it doesn't work and function as it does in those shows, but it reinforces the idea that it does, that it's meting out justice when it's actually meting out injustice. And so when we put out the report, it went viral for a few weeks. It was really affirming to see the response to it, but Hollywood had not responded to it. And no one had responded in a direct way, but we were having conversations. And then the pandemic happened, and then things got quiet, and then the protests began. And at one point, the president tweeted out Law and Order. And what he was trying to do, and this goes to the power of narrative, was try to put forth a dog whistle for his base of people to say, like, we need Law and Order at this moment. But in that instance, most of us have grown up watching Law and Order TV show. What actually the response that went viral was like, Dick Wolf is the cause of the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. That Law and Order, this show, is actually the reason we're here. And actually, it became a win and a solution for us, because then we were able to launch an initiative called Change Hollywood divestments.org in partnership with Michael B. Jordan and a host of other industry actors and Endeavor Content, a major agency, signed on to it. And basically what they're committing to is no more anti-racist content, but really committing to Black authentic storytelling. It's an effort within the context to really shift narrative. They're committing to advocating for hiring consultants that are like us, individuals who are working on these issues, committed to these issues, to be in the writers' rooms, to make sure those authentic stories are being told, to allow us to review and integrate the recommendations in our report, and to ensure that the multiple, at senior levels, that Black people have the decision-making power to greenlight content that is reaffirming and accountable to us. And so that was like a big solution, big shift. And it happened in a way that we didn't anticipate it, but it happened because of the protests and the pandemic and the organizing of everyone else, but also in this moment where what people thought would be a narrative of dog whistle was actually reinforced now through what all of us have grown up listening to, like that sound, the sound of Law and Order. That's what people are thinking about now, this show and how it has devastated us. And so the last thing I'll add is that we launched also a platform called the blackresponse.org. It was our response to COVID-19. And you'll see a lot of the actions that we've taken from working to ensure that, and working with Gina is working on this as well, but those who have been locked up and exposed, we know that, you can't social distance in jail. You can't social distance when you're locked up. And so how do we ensure that there's the opportunity to do that? So launching campaigns to get people out, our Mama's Day campaign that we're working to get people who can't afford bail. So all those things that we're doing kind of reinforced within this, but this idea about how to disrupt, and I like what Dr. Stevenson said in the beginning, how to disrupt the way in which these narratives and intervene in this moment to address the ways in which the stories have been told about us. And then the last thing is the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color put out a toolkit, which I'll share also in the chat, where I talk a little bit about this, but there's some solutions in there as well in terms of how we reframe. But the biggest, and I think Leah spoke to this, is the need for asset framing, which all of us have now agreed to, and I think has been a major solution and shift within philanthropy, thanks to the work of Sean Harper and Dr. Stevenson and others who began to reinforce this notion that we can't just start with the problem, we have to start with solutions. We have to look at us as assets, not the problem. And so I think that has been tremendous. And I know like also Travian Shorters with Be Me has been leading this effort as well. So I think those are solutions we should look to, and I'll pass it on.
Yeah, Gina, I'm going to come over to you next because both Rashid was talking about New Orleans as a epicenter of resistance of culture, but I wanted to talk about that. But you just said something, Rashid, that has been a challenge with us who are doing advocacy and policy. We're trying to change the language of ex-offender. We're trying to change the language of minority as we are giving feedback as a part of this effort. And it's like, well, it's easier. People won't know what that means if we don't say ex-offender. And so we're actively doing that. And so we need to make sure that as what we're doing in community, what we're doing in Hollywood and so forth in our broader culture actually permeates to our policymakers. And some of them are open to that. We need more folks who look like us, in staffers doing that work, but that is also a challenge as well. And I just wanted to call that out as something that we could collectively work on together. So Gina, and then we'll kind of turn it to Paul and the question after you. But what has this moment meant for decarceration, the defund police and schools? You've been doing this work, but the actual investment that you all have been a part of building across the state and in New Orleans?
So thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. So basically, Flick has to see opportunity in every situation and in every disaster. As definitely, we believe that the children who are locked in prison really shouldn't have been there and in the first place. And as Rashid brought up, Katrina. So like Katrina, COVID has illuminated systems issues that perpetuate inequalities, right? And so what we talk about a lot is that, we've been at this work for more than 19 years, and we shouldn't have to be, right? Like, we passed reform in 2003 that put together a roadmap, and I put the link in our in the box, right? We put together a mapping around that, and so it included proven community-based alternatives to incarceration. So our children shouldn't still be locked in prison, right? Because we've been talking about decarceration, divesting in prisons and penal systems, and putting the money into community-based alternatives. So what that actually means at this point is that, we're trying to move past dreams and making the dreams that we've been talking about a reality. So, we've been dreaming of the systems that actually work for our kids and our families, that are to create and not just to serve, but to heal our communities and heal our families. And so, like at Flick, we believe that the children are our future, right? And so we want every child to enjoy the rights and opportunities. And what that means is, to be able to get there, that we need to work with impacted individuals to make sure that they're respected, acknowledged, and paid for their time to make all of these dreams a reality. Like, we can't continue to expect that the most burdened and oppressed to take on and solve the problems that were erected by this broken system. And so we were struggling for life and death over and over again, while the world continues to watch, Katrina, COVID. We had just had Sally. Like, right now, we've been in Laura, and we've been working with our families in Lake Charles. And ironically, we moved our office and opened our offices after Katrina in the Lake Charles area, and then had to move from Rita. And so we constantly are reliving all of the different traumas. So what we want is to develop programs that rehabilitates and are successful around re-entry for our formerly incarcerated young people. We want to hire youth of similar backgrounds, and that's been a thing that Flick has been done. We've always hired most impacted individuals, and a lot of those folks have gone on to create in their community what they see that they need. And so, but those things have to be funded. People have to be able to live and take care of their families, and in turn take care of their communities. So we're committed to this work, but again, we can't keep doing it for free. So we put the power into the hands of those most impacted, continually to employ them as credible messages, just like Rashid spoke about. It's really going to take us to change the system, but we have to work together, continue to develop the trust in our communities, lift each other up and not tear each other down, because change is possible, but it's going to happen when we make it happen, because we already know we're powerful, but we have to continue to support that. And I do see that, some change is happening, but it has to continue, and we need to stay focused and recognize that we're dealing with a racist system, and we shouldn't have to keep changing the names of things to make others comfortable. We've been talking about that, but we do that over and over again. Like, when I first came to this work, instead of talking about it being as a racist system, we were talking about disproportionate minority confinement. We moved from, divesting and investing, and now we're defunding and all of those things. And that's, we might have to repackage things, but I think we also just need to be truthful and call a spade a spade. And so we'll know the enemy that we're fighting, so that we can continue to make progress and bring our histories with us, right? And add the future. Our young people have different ways of maybe thinking about things and looking at things and solving things. So there's a space for our past, our current, and our future. And so we need to, if we talk about intersectionality, I think that we need to bring all of those things together. And folks are talking about, we're not celebrating our 19th year anniversary. We shouldn't have to be here 19 years later, but for for the anniversary, we made a video clip, and our families are still saying the same thing today that they said 19 years ago, and that shouldn't have to happen. But we will definitely keep being, being here and bringing those people who are most impacted, because as was said, they're closest to the problem, they're closest to the solution. And we have to keep working and keep doing that until we tear this system down.
Amen. Amen to tearing the system down. So hopefully y'all who are watching out there are getting lots of the resources that all of our panelists have shared and talked about. I believe the Forward Promise team is going to share some of the results of the first chat, the first poll, and then we'll have another poll. We'll get into a couple of questions, y'all, that came in from the audience. So are we sharing the poll now? All right. And all right. So this was from the first poll, and that was a question about, what have you learned about your community or other communities today? All right. And I can't quite see the screen, but you all can see it. All right. And so we'll go to the next poll here. And it's really a question about the disrupting strategies that you all might be working on. Narrative change, policy change, advocacy. We talked about also some direct services that folks are doing and are taking place in your community organization. So please share what you are doing the most. This information kind of helps the Forward Promise team to better understand what's happening out there in the field as they continue to support this work of sharing and teaching the understanding of dehumanization and disrupting it. So which one of the disrupting strategies are taking place in your organization or community? Uplifting narrative change, supporting boys and young men of color through direct service, or supporting boys and young men of color through policy change and advocacy. Again, we will be sharing those results later on before we get off of the session. I believe the team put them up. All right, so let's get into some of these questions from the audience. The very first one was from an audience that said, as a white person, how can I find, learn, better understand the ways to hold systems accountable? And so a lot of you talked about the accountability that is needed in terms of disruption that we all have to do. But this is a question as a white person, how can I find, learn, better understand tools and so forth that could help systems accountable? So anyone want to jump in? I'd love to hear all your perspectives.
I'll jump in. Just to start, because I think all of us probably have things to offer, and I think actually the question came up earlier around allyship, and I think want to thank the person for even asking the question of how they can engage, because though our humanity is clear, I think there's the real dehumanization. The challenge is that for white people engaging in white supremacy, they're losing their humanization as well. And so I think the first step is acknowledging the challenge that's at the forefront. We're not the ones voting for policies at the majority level that are harming Black people. We are not the ones putting forth policies that are dismantling or putting in place systems that are harming us. And so I think the first thing is, and I always encourage folks who want to be allies, it's like, how can they organize their own communities to engage in the efforts that they're hearing about today? I think the work that, Shop Foundation, Gina's organization, Color Change, Oz's work, even Forward Promise, all these places have extreme resources on our websites. And I would say start there, visiting our websites, learning about the genius that's here. I mean, Dr. Stevenson is a doctor, has been doing this for decades, and, comes from a pedigree of individuals who are committed to this work. And I think getting that research and that information is accessible and available to you. And I think visiting our websites are there. And then as you engage, Color Change, for example, as you become a member, we have allies. We can't do this without a full commitment. To Gina's point, we need to do this in community. We can win, we can change things, but it's going to take all of us who are committed to justice and equity to come together and speak out and speak loudly, because the sound of authoritarianism and injustice is louder right now. And I think, and that's what I mean about changing the narrative and owning the narrative. We need to be able to have our own organs. And so I would say the other thing is, allies can donate to these organizations, Gina's group, supporting and then working closely with individuals. And so those are things I would say when we think about allyship and where you can get information. I think all of us have shared a lot of resources today. And those resources are accessible through all the platforms that all of us are members of. And so I would say visit our websites, and I'm sure Forward Promise will follow up and get you more information.
Yes, thank you, Rashid. Anyone else? Howard, yeah, Dr. Stevenson.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question as well. As Rashid has said, I think one of the things that's strange in this world is that whiteness has power, influence, and there are ways in which white people can talk to other white people about how they're thinking about the world. Like, how do you disrupt conversations that are happening every day that some of us are not privy to? Right? Mitch McConnell, I mean, on some level, in the ways that we underestimate, the process and the system does work for some people better than others. And so how can we use that? We're learning a lot. When I teach around the country or speak to audiences, particularly schools, I'm reminded of another thing, that children can be very powerful in talking to their parents. My brother and sister and I, as early as 11 years old, talked my parents out of smoking, because we saw so many commercials of death and destruction from smoking. Coming home from school as latchkey kids, we got together and convinced our parents that smoking was not good for them, and they listened to us on that occasion. And so I hear more students challenging their parents, white children challenging their parents, because they have access to social media in a way that kids in the 60s did not, 70s did not. And so listen to children in a way as to, in many respects, many of us have said, and I think Rashid alluded to us, and everyone on the panel alluded, that what Black and brown people want is that when teachers see our children or police see our children, we want you to imagine your children, because we know if you see other people's children as your kids, you won't shoot them, you won't expel them, you won't treat them as inhuman. And so in that same vein, that means you're risking your own health and life to stand up for justice, not just as an idea, but because there's somebody you really care about is going to be the end, is going to be at the brunt of that injustice. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Anyone else before we take another question? All right, okay. Oh, Aza, yes.
I was just going to add very quickly, I completely agree with everything that Dr. Stevenson and Rashid already shared. One thing I want to also uplift, particularly when it comes to questions of allyship. One, this work has been ongoing for a really long time. And there are people, I know, I can guarantee there are people in your local community and context who've been doing this, who've been laboring, who've been struggling. Connect with them, plug in with them, and figure out what they need. What resources do they need, and what resources do you have capacity to provide, and start from there. I think the depth of our connections and how we cultivate them is going to be so critical, particularly in a moment where we are more physically isolated than we have been before. And the other thing I want to note as well is when it comes to allyship, we have to be ready and prepared to be uncomfortable. There has to be a measure of sacrifice. We were talking about a system that has allocated resources in ways that accelerate dehumanization and death for some people, but has accelerated power and wealth concentration for others. And so for those who have reaped the benefits of that system, sacrifice is going to be a necessary component of being in this struggle, and doing so in a way that is grounded and rooted in these principles of justice.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for sharing that. And there's a lot of resources. When I get asked these questions, it's really about, trusting Black leadership, Black-led organizations in particular. I've been struck and dumbfounded, which is why a lot of the work that we do is really about supporting youth and young adults to understand policy, to demystify it so that they can, to be called on by staffers and congressional hearings and so forth, because we always have to have a representative because they know what's best, right? And so it's not enough of us, and as we're trying to construct new policies at various levels of government, we have to be there at the forefront. And it's just, quite frankly, not enough of us. And that's by design. We get into this work after our careers, but not knowing that this is a pipeline of influencers who've created the very same policies we're trying to dismantle for many of us from the 90s, the crime bill, TANF, the Workforce Investment and Act. All of those happened in the 90s, and they have contributed and propelled what we see in these last 30 years. And so we have to go back, not to 2015, not to 2014, we're going back 400 years, but we could just go back to what happened in the 90s when some of us on this session were coming of age, when we were really cheering for particular parties. And, we know racism is neither red or blue. So it really challenges us and allies who are in these spaces to have their own introspection of what they have been complicit in creating the environment we're at now. So that's a little bit of the work that I'm embarking on, or we're embarking on at Classman. It's difficult. It's very difficult. So another question for y'all, and then we're going to get to some call to action from everyone. We've talked a lot about mental health or healing. Dr. Stevenson, you talked about, again, how all of this is making us sick, and Rashid talked about how it's killing us. How do we disrupt that? And what are some of the ways in which we move towards healing? And we can go all the way down. So I don't know if you want to start, Dr. Stevenson.
Okay, I think one of the amazing things when we learn about our history, and it's still a lot I don't know, and the more I hear and read, I'm appalled and also excited, if that can make any sense, that really what we don't know can harm us, right? I've been reading William Darity and Mullen partners' work called From Here to Equality, case for Black reparations. And what they do is a wonderful job of scaffolding. We knew we were struggling, we knew about enslavement, but we didn't always go to the details of how much was stolen from us, from indigenous folks, from Native folks, from Black folks, or the degree of violence that was applied to maintain, and that reflect the kind of wealth and health disparities that we see today. And the more you talk about it and read about it, you realize, wow, man, that narrative of inferiority was pretty powerful, just like Rashid is talking about, right? That lie contributed to a lot of justification of an examining. And if I internalize that, and I know all of us kind of have, health strategies from not only Dr. Hubbard, but psychologically, what kind of self-defense must I also engage in psychologically to not minimize my own suffering or what I can do about it? And I think, we have this stuff in our work in racial literacy called healthy racial comeback lines, so that even young people, when they get insulted by microaggressions, they may seem small, But if you're still thinking about it a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 months later, I've worked with folks in their 80s who will remember something that happened when they were a childhood because they didn't have the voice to speak up in that moment, right? And so we use healthy racial comeback lines as a way to say, I reject your rejection of me. I will not let one moment, 1 second pass by before I allow you to dehumanize me in this moment, right? And there are certain styles that Black and brown people have and children have to stand up for themselves. That's important. Their body is involved. My heart and soul is involved to reject that rejection. So that doesn't affect my health. It doesn't affect my breathing, doesn't affect my sleeping, which is probably the most challenging evidence that we have, that these microaggressions seem small, but if they affect your quality of sleep and your quality of breathing, then we should be talking and preparing very differently around our fitness and our health and our voice to speak up, even in the small spaces.
Yes, Leah, I see you shaking. I hear you, but not actually see you shaking your head. And so, how does that healing manifest, or should manifest in education?
Yeah, so a couple things. I think one, and we started off this conversation talking about as a people, our strongholds in our faith, right? And so faith is essentially believing in something, or the unseen or the unknown. And so I draw these lines of like faith, imagination, and social justice is not just the work that we do, but it is literally how we live our lives. And so when I think about this question of like mental health, I think that, and I've talked a lot about on this session today, like the work of reimagining. I think that there's a mental health component to that we have to create, it's darn hard to do this, right? But we have to create space and take seriously what it would mean to like dream of a new world. That's the work that we're doing. That's what social justice work is all about. But I think there is this piece of like just allowing ourselves to sit still, which we know is hard for us to do, right? Because there's so much to do, but to sit still and to really imagine something different. I think just how like spiritually fulfilling, how good that could be for our mental health is an exercise that I think as social justice leaders, as advocates, is something we should be doing. To your question around how it manifests in schools, I think it's similar, right? That imagine that our children would be in school actually doing something beyond just rote memorization of out-of-date concepts, but that they would be looking at the world around them and learning from the world and using what they're learning to recreate and try to create something amazing and new. All are things that I think need to be a part of it. On a very practical standpoint, as we've seen in the last couple of months, work that folks like Gina have been doing, it's beginning, it feels like it's coming to fruition around like the police free schools work. So let's imagine for a second that we don't have police in schools, but we actually have mental health specialists. We have counselors who are not approaching our kids, not re-traumatizing our kids. They're not approaching our students with trauma, with therapies and counseling that, you know, is deficit based, but is actually affirming and it brings strengths to the table. I think that's key, is like we literally need counselors in our schools. We need to create schools that allow children and students, and not just children, but allow our educators, especially as we think about what it will mean to return to school. Where is the space for folks to really grieve, for folks to talk about what this experience has been for them on a personal level, but also our collective grief. We need to make sure that those opportunities are going to be present in the schools.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to get to our kind of call to action. And we thank everyone who's been listening and joining in and being community with us this afternoon. And for those of you who are going to watch later, I know I watch many of these webcasts, you know, in my wee hours of the night, Dr. Stevenson, when I can't sleep, to give me some energy. But Aza, you gave us a lot of call to actions already. And I personally am going to be following up with you. And I don't think we've done enough work explicitly centering disability justice in our work. And so thank you for that. But what's your call to action? One thing that for the folks who are watching and will watch can do to disrupt social dehumanization?
Thank you. So I'm gonna cheat a little bit because it's 1.5 things. But I invite people to get involved in your local mutual aid network. We've been talking about how those of us who are most impacted by these systems are those best positioned to know what we need. We understand we keep us safe, right? We can show up for each other in ways that are extremely transformative and affirming. And so these kind of practices of mutual aid that have kind of totally flipped on their head these hierarchical notions of how we meet people's needs, and instead have really modeled what interdependence and mutuality and community building looks like. Figure out what closest mutual aid project there is and figure out what they need, and please get involved. And then that 0.5 thing that I'll tack on to the end of it is please go online and check out the We Grieve Together National Week of Mourning that will begin in the first week of October, and figure out how to get involved. There are all kinds of ways that you can help uplift that work through the digital toolkit that's already been prepared. And I want to shout out the work of abolitionist organizer and leader Kelly Hayes for all of the labor she put into making these convenings happen.
Thank you. Gina, what's your charge? One thing.
Yes, so I would say disallow othering, right? So we have another saying here at Flick, we need to pass the My Child test. And what that means and what that looks like is that if you are participating in or you're putting together a law or a policy that you would not do for your own child, then it should not happen for someone else's child. If you are seeing things going on in the system, if you are voting for who is not thinking about our children, those who are the least of these, then you should, maybe rethink that vote. So, I mean, just basically putting, good human practice, put yourself in another person's situation. And if you would not do that for your own self, then please don't do it for me and my children or our families. It just doesn't even make sense.
Mm-hmm. All right, Leah, let's go back to you, and then Rashid will end with you with one of your charges.
Definitely. So what I would charge is that there are a number of education justice advocacy organizations across this country that are working tirelessly to improve public education. And I would say, just really on a very practical note, they need resources. They are doing amazing work. Gina is obviously one of those represents one of those organizations that are just doing incredible work with limited resources. And so find those organizations. You can go to the Schott Foundation website. We partner and support many of them, but find those organizations and donate money, read about the amazing work they're doing, and support those folks.
Thank you. And Rashid.
I want to start by saying thank you to the organizers and Dr. Stevenson and Rhonda for allowing space and inviting me to be part of the conversation. I will keep mine simple. Join an organization, stay active, get engaged, do not be dismayed. I always keep with me Toni Morrison, a source of self-regard, read. And then the last thing is one of her quotes, 2 quotes. The very serious function of racism is to distract us and keep us distracted. Let us not be distracted. She also said, if you want to fly, you have to give up the thing that weighs you down. Let us work towards flying. And that reminds me of a last quote that I'll end with, which is Assata Shakur, which has been the namesake of the Black Lives Matter movement, is if it's our duty to fight for our freedom, It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose by our chains. So that's my call.
Amen. Dr. Stevenson, do you want to give a charge? I know you and Dr. Rhonda Bryant have been doing, and the whole Forward Promise team have been on the journey for a long time, but what would you want to charge those who's going to be?
Thank you. On behalf of my colleague, Rhonda Bryant, I would just say the lion story will never be known as long as a hunter is the one to tell it. If you tell your story, if you embrace your own narrative, if you fall in love with your story, you are automatically disruptive in this world. Thank you.
Thank you. So the Forward Promise team are going to put the results of the second poll in the chat wherever you're watching, so we can just see where all of you are doing and where your work is already at in disrupting social dehumanization or dehumanization at large. Something that has been keeping me grounded, and I think no matter what your spirituality or religious background, it's something that we could all kind of understand. It's 2 Corinthians, and it's, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but we are not in despair. We are persecuted, but we are not abandoned. We are struck down, but we are not destroyed. And literally, when I have that kind of feeling, you talked about those microaggressions, Dr. Stevenson, you know, we have to call on that, you know, and really that ancestral spirit that is flowing through us and with us, that is keeping us steady. But there's work to be done, right? And so we've learned this afternoon so many resources for those of us who are already doing the work, to build upon, to expand, for those of us who are new and this, and we're like, wow, this is happening. What can I do? There are ways for you to get engaged. And so we know that the Forward Promise team are going to put all the different links in the chat, but reach out to all of these panelists and everyone following you, you know, listening or joining. They'll be willing to talk to you and willing for you to be in community, because it's going to take collective action to disrupt the centuries of dehumanization that have been inflicted on Black people, African people, brown people, not only here in the US, but throughout the world. So it takes all of us. So I want to thank you for joining me today. I'm fired up, and now I have to go kind of talk about workforce policy. So I'll try to bring some of that energy in there. But we want you to take the post-event reflection survey. It'll appear on your screen. And we want you to commit to participating in the entire webcast series. You will be able to listen to some of the ones that happened before. The next one is Justifiable Rage and Undeniable Tears. And I certainly have held back a few tears throughout this couple of hours together. That's going to be on Tuesday, October 6th at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you'll be able to watch it through all the various live stream channels. So I just want to say thank you, everyone, and for your spirit, for your presence here. And I look forward to being in community with you all again.